So thanks for that introduction. It's really good to be here. In addition to my permanent appointment at Brigham Young University, I'm also spending this year at the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, which, truth be told, I think that's why Jolt had me come, because they could save on the airfare. But I'm happy to be here anyway. So today I'm going to be drawing on some research that I've done with these two colleagues you see mentioned here, Saskia Ruhlebel at Radboud and Grant Mitchell, who's with me at the Democracy Institute, and also a little bit of research I've done earlier with my colleague Leventa Litve, who's also at the CEU Democracy Institute. And what I want to talk about is really it's about democratic backsliding or erosion. But I want to make a couple points about that today. One is, and I think this is a point that others have already been making, I'll just be reaffirming it, that we can't really understand why that erosion, why that illiberalism today is happening without considering the ideas that motivate leaders to engage in that backsliding. Those ideas, there may not be a sufficient cause, but they are a necessary one we need to take into account. That's what motivates Jolt's bigger project and that of others here too. I'll also want to suggest more specifically that populism is one of those very important ideas, and that studying it gives us some predictive power and even some suggestions about the best ways of presenting and responding to that backsliding. And I'll try to get to that at the end. Okay, I'll give a little example so you understand what I mean. Hugo Chavez, the former president of Venezuela, and a leader that most scholars, whatever definition of populism they use, they would agree he's a populist. And as a populist, he had some impact on aspects of life in Venezuela, including things like their economic policy and well-being. Here, though, I'm just going to focus on his impact on democracy in that country. And on the one hand, there actually were some positive things we could talk about. Voter turnout increased by 30% during his time in office. That's a remarkable increase in voter participation, right? To have people coming out, turning out for elections. He did create new forms of direct democracy that were put into the country's constitution. One of those, the capacity to have presidential recall referendums, was used against him just 5 years in office. He weathered that crisis. He won the election. And he did create new organizations and public policies on behalf of the poor, redistributive policies. A number of these called misiones that I studied for a while, and they had a real impact. So on the one hand, but on the other, Chavez and his government routinely abused government funds for elections. This could happen in a more distant way by the way they distributed the funds in some of those programs I mentioned. They were targeted to certain localities, but also in the way that money was handled during the campaign. It was quite common actually during a campaign to be in the country and see government buildings with big banners on them saying "Vote for Chavez." And those were paid for with government money, sitting on a government building. It was kind of ugly. There was not a banner there for the opposition, needless to say. So that became pervasive. The decline in media freedom. So in 1999, when he came to power, Venezuela had kind of a proud tradition of a sort of activist media that saw itself as neutral and following good practices of Western journalism. And today, the government's taken over or eliminated pretty much all of those outlets: press, the print media, television, radio. It's very hard if you're in the country, if you don't have access to the internet, to get good information on what's really going on out there. So it's been a very negative outcome. And of course, Chavez ruled most of the time by decree. His legislature, fairly pliant, they just gave him decree powers year after year. And so the powers of government became concentrated in the executive branch. The same thing was experienced by the judiciary branch, which, I mean, it was basically taken over. He eliminated judges who were against him and put in their place judges who were partisan appointees. He did the same to the National Electoral Commission and so forth. So the independence of these branches of government was gone. In other words, Chavez, as a populist, created what we could call a competitive authoritarian regime. There were elections. Once or twice, the opposition won them, but it was very difficult. And today, of course, it's slid even further, and we call Venezuela simply an autocracy today. So, all right. That's one example, pretty lively one. The question would be, well, is this a more general phenomenon? And yes, it is. We have pretty good data that shows this global impact of populists on these different aspects of democracy that's repeated in global data sets, positive side and on the negative side. The data I'll show you here, it's a little different from what Michael Coppage was showing earlier. I'm going to show you some data drawn from called the Global Populism Database. And that's an effort to measure populism not with an expert survey, but by looking directly at what leaders say. We analyze their speeches to see if they use populist rhetoric. This database in particular looks at the speeches of chief executives. So whereas Michael's data brought together both the parties of the incumbent, but also parties of the challenger, the opposition, and kind of took a country average, this is just going to look at who the president of the country is and how populist he is. So let's show you some results here. There we go. Oh, that was kind of, I don't know why there aren't any dots on that graph, but just so you see what it should look like, kind of like that. Okay, there we go. This tracks the correlation of populism across the globe with the change in voter turnout. So what we saw in Venezuela is actually repeated globally. If we look at the left-hand graph, it's just a change in turnout from the beginning of the term of this leader to the end. On the right, we take into account the starting level of turnout because it turns out there's a ceiling effect. And this slight positive correlation is evident in many other countries. Populists are generally associated with increases in turnout. So some aspects of what they do could be considered positive. On the other hand, we see a lot of negative effects. So this looks at populism and press freedom using an indicator from the Freedom House database. And I want to reassure Michael that I will use varieties of democracy. It's going to come up to just, this work was a little older and we were still toying around with some other indicators. The left-hand graph is just the value of this press freedom indicator at the end of their term. The graph on the right shows you the change from the beginning of the term to the end, a little more precise indicator there on the right. And you see it goes down. Yeah, press freedom's dropping in most of these populist countries. We see a similar decline in terms of checks and balances. This is an indicator from the polity database, executive constraint. So power, again, being concentrated in the executive. And more generally, if we look at a general indicator of democracy like the polity 2 indicator, we see democracy going down in these populist countries. So negative associations between populism and various indicators of democratic contestation. And overall, a picture of populists leading to something like competitive authoritarianism, if not worse. All right. So that's kind of part one. And what we found with the data I showed you there has been actually demonstrated by a number of other studies. This really isn't all that new. Several quantitative analyses in particular, looking at global data sets and regional data sets. I mentioned some of those scholars here. And making this claim that populism undermines these procedural liberal elements of democracy, like civil liberties or institutions of electoral accountability, quality of elections, summing up to democratic backsliding. The other part of our research has been to ask a question that would hone in a little more on the question that's kind of been motivating a lot of us today, which is, yeah, but what about populism is doing this? And within the populism literature, there are several approaches to how to define this, what causes it, what its consequences are. But the main one in this case, when we're looking at populism and democracy, will be the one I work with, the ideation approach, very common in Europe. Michael's own definition of measurement that they're using in the V-Party database is drawn essentially from this approach. And then on the other hand, we have the political strategic approach. Let me talk about the differences and the arguments that these make. And this is important because studies from both of these will show a correlation between populism and declines in democracy, but you'll see in a moment, they don't really answer the question of why. And I think that question is important. The ideational approach says these ideas of populism are actually very important. When we say populism, we mean this discourse that frames politics as a struggle between the will of the common people and an evil conspiring elite. And that view is important. It motivates leaders. Give you some examples here. One would be that if you see your opponents as evil, well, you might not only be able to justify taking away their civil liberties, you might think that it's necessary, because if you don't, they'll use those as opportunities to take over the state again and to harm the people. So you start to, you're able to justify rolling back civil liberties like media freedom. Likewise, if you're pro-people in this way, you reimagine elections, not as a competitive exercise to help us find the best solution that it's a compromise or that might be the one that most people want, but it's an expression of this pre-existing popular will. That's what elections are for. They're about expressing the will. And so the competitive elements, they don't matter. We can do away with fairness in our elections. And finally, it's actually fairly common. I could give you a little bit of a theory behind this, but the most successful populist parties and movements, they do have charismatic leaders. The leaders are really important for helping everybody in the movement, if it's a big movement, coordinate what they're doing, coordinate things like campaign strategies, and who's going to run for the legislature. Everybody in a populist movement has so many different views except their populism but a leader, a charismatic leader that we all agree embodies our will, they can come along and just tell us who's going to run for what office and how we'll run the campaign. The most successful populist parties and movements usually are movements built around a charismatic leader, but then that has another consequence, which is that if we think that leader who embodies our will is now in power, why do we need independent countervailing branches of government? We can get rid of those and let the president get on with running the country. So the ideas, according to the ideation approach, would be what drives this. The political strategic approach is going to take a very different view of this. It says, well, the ideas actually are just kind of window dressing. We don't think the leader really believes any of this. What really matters is they're all just interested in maximizing votes in office. So it's their strategic self-interest that's at work, and we only have to consider the things going on around them. So one might be the kind of organization they have. If they've created a personalistic movement, then there might not be a lot of people to keep that leader in check once he's in power. If that leader's an outsider, as they often are, they don't have the connections they need to make it feasible to have compromises and work with your opponents once in office. And so it's easier just to get rid of them. And finally, if the voters have been demanding this, then you better give the voters what they want. And if what they want is that you take over the country, well, you'll do it. Again, the view then is that this is all mostly a result of the leaders just being in the right place at the right time and motivated by their interest to control power. This is what they do. The ideas really don't explain much. So we wanted to test this. We thought, well, this is actually a really important distinct claim. This matters because it helps us understand if all the ideas that we're studying actually make a difference. And the fact is, we don't know why. The literature on this has been, it's kind of funny, but we've got a lot of studies. I was citing these, but the indicators that we use often are not the best. So somebody will create a data set and they'll say, okay, here's the populist, here's the non-populist. The closer you look at what they created, you realize, well, they coded that themselves without any kind of replication. It's just their judgment. And when you look at their criteria, they'll lump together things like, well, they belong to a movement and they say some pro-people things. And you think, well, okay, that indicator is not going to allow me to distinguish between these two theories. We need some new indicators to help us get at this. So we ran some new analyses. We took our measure, the global populist database I showed you. That's going to be one important independent variable in the study we'll run. And then the other is, well, anyway, I don't want to criticize the other side here, but I will. So the political strategic side has been a little reluctant to create larger data sets. And when they've done so, they haven't always been very replicable. So we created our own. We took three components that they highlight in their literature. Personalism, which we measured from the V-Party database that Michael's already referenced. Outsider status, Miguel Carreras did some great work on this, and we expanded his data set to update that to the present. And then another indicator from the V-Party database, whether the party, what kind of local party offices they use as an indicator of their institutionalization. And because there's some debate in that other literature on how to combine these things or what counts, we just took an additive index. Elsewhere, in other results, we break down the index, we measure each component separately. And now, I've been given the 5-minute mark here. I want to just quickly show you the results. As you can imagine, I wouldn't be here sharing this if we didn't have really cool findings that we thought were right. But I want to get to some quick thoughts at the end as well. So let me show you two things. One is just to graph a sense of how these data work. This is probably typical that this measure that we use based on analyzing speeches tends to be more selective. It's harder to actually say something populist in a speech and get it noticed by the coder and have the coders agree about it. And so you tend not to see as many in the upper left quadrant. On the other hand, on the lower right, which captures the political strategic approach, you see a number of leaders that they would say are populist. And in terms of their speeches, they really aren't. So one of these, an example here from the region I've studied a lot in Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, often considered a populist, especially by political strategic scholars, mostly because of his personalism in office. And frankly, he had some illiberal attitudes and ideas. On the other hand, if you look at the speeches and what he says, he doesn't say populist things. He doesn't talk in terms of people versus elite, and that's not a strong feature of his rhetoric. So in ideational terms, not very populist. In political strategic terms, it is. So we see some difference in the two databases that will allow us then to see some different results. I'm going to skip past most of the research design and get to the results of the analysis. So you wouldn't think this was revolutionary, but we just brought both indicators into the same analysis. That's it. And the ones on the top reflect ours, this populist discourse. Those little dots in the bars away from the center line say, yeah, this actually matters a lot. It's associated on its own with, after controlling this other measure with a decline in these democracy indicators. And we looked at the cleanliness of elections, civil liberties, and horizontal accountability, all taken from the Varieties of Democracy database. In contrast, the measures of the political strategic index don't seem to matter. The bottom line then, in this and in a series of other reliability, robustness checks that we ran, seems to show that what the leader says, what we track in their speeches, populism in that sense, really seems to explain very well, or at least correlate very well, with their behavior in office and how they treat democracy. And these other features, how they organize themselves and their movement, seems not to matter nearly as much as these ideas. So let me jump to the conclusion, say a couple things. One is, yes, hooray, our theory may be a better one. That's sort of personally satisfying, but I think there are a couple of other more important lessons. One is I'd caution us from saying the ideas explain everything. I don't think that's right. I think that these sorts of hard factors, if you will, organizational features, often work in tandem with the populist ideas. An example of this would be if we have a movement, a party that's noted for its populist language, but the leader is not particularly personalist. They're confronted with a highly institutionalized party. We actually might not expect to see them concentrate power in the executive branch if they win office. So how they're organized could still provide a constraint on their ideas and the motivation they provide. At the same time, we don't want to emphasize that the hard factors are insufficient predictors. So even if a leader comes from a very personalistic movement, by itself, I wouldn't expect that to mean that they're going to try to destroy democracy once they get there. We need to consider the ideas that motivate populists or other leaders in the first place. Ideas about how they view democracy, ideas that many of you have been studying today, Jolt in particular, with your study. We think those matter a great deal. And I mentioned the utility these provide. The indicators we have here, Michael's data are collected a little differently. I think the speech data is a little better, but this does give us some predictive power. For example, if we analyze Donald Trump's speeches during the 2024 campaign, we would have learned that he's, by the way, more populist than he was in the 2016 campaign. That would have been an important warning sign that we could have shared and sort of planned for. And but that wasn't something that we picked up on or did, but we could have. So the data are out there. We have these indicators that I think are significant. The last thing to emphasize is that the populist argument also tells us something really important about the kinds of responses we need to have towards these illiberal movements. And this has been brought up a couple of times today. And this is that within the populist argument, there's usually a germ of some idea, a grievance that actually has, even from a liberal perspective, some validity. There might be reasons why citizens affected by immigration are upset about this. And we need to have a response to the claim that as citizens, they may have certain rights that need to be respected and defended. Likewise, concerns about, as has been mentioned, the impact of economic globalization, that there's something to the complaint. What this tells me is that the populist is acting as a kind of a warning sign, telling us that our liberal system right now is falling short in some key policy areas, and that as a liberal system, it should be kind of embarrassed about that. And instead of being defensive, try to find ways of addressing those policy issues without having to give up on its liberal principles. I'll leave it at that.